Moving on, earlier this week, two Just Stop Oil activists were jailed for a 2022 attack on a classic Van Gogh painting with tomato soup. Phoebe Plummer and Anna Holland have received 2 years and 20 months jail term, respectively, for causing over £10,000 worth of damage to the priceless, although I guess we could work out its price extrapolating that £10,000, the 1888 piece. In court, Plummer said, "My choice today is to accept whatever sentence I receive with a smile. It is not just myself being sentenced today or my co-defendants, but the foundations of democracy itself." What do Just Stop Oil eco-warriors expect to achieve with these stunts, as well as criminal damage? What is the cultural damage of such behaviour? Well, I'm joined now to discuss these points further by art critic and editor of Art Review magazine, JJ Charlesworth, and spokesman for Just Stop Oil, Dr. Kush. Thank you very much for coming in. So, I mean, have lessons been learned now? I guess because now there's a court summary, we're not going to see this anymore. Is that what's happening?
Well, I think the question that Phoebe asked when she carried out that action is what is worth more, art or life? And I think it's a pretty common sense answer. If there was a fire in that gallery on that day, would you be going to save the painting or would you be going to save the child that's in the gallery? Obviously, what we need to take from this is the fact that our planet, our home, is on fire, and we're not doing enough to protect life. So I work as a doctor in the NHS on a day-to-day basis. I spend all of my time trying to protect life. And now, in the evenings and weekends, whenever I have spare time, I try to do that with Just Stop Oil.
But have you not made a false dichotomy there by, given a choice between saving a baby or some art, I would save a baby, but the act that we're talking about might not save the baby. Effectively, you're saying, save a baby or save art, but what you're going to do is throw some soup. Well, none of them are going to be saved by the soup throwing.
So right now, hundreds of thousands of people are dying because of the effects of the climate crisis.
Yeah, your premise is valid, but
nothing that anyone has done so far has been able to protect those lives from being lost.
Right. But
so what I'm saying,
because other things haven't saved them, will throwing soup save them? Just because others haven't, it doesn't prove that soup is a solution.
I don't know, but I think it's worth trying. I don't think that we should take throwing soup at art off the cards when it comes to facing what is an existential threat in terms of the climate breaking down. OK. JJ, from the art point of view, how do you what's your reading of this case?
I think the question for me is why do that act to kind of take that platform, get in the public eye, get it into social media to kind of throw stuff at a priceless painting attracts attention. So, we can have a discussion about climate crisis or climate change. In terms of what it does to do this, it basically draws everybody's attention to the idea that high culture or fine art or things that we value very much aren't actually as valuable or as important as the one thing that we've all got to focus on, which is climate crisis. And I have a bit of an issue with that kind of, the way in which that's essentially saying, look, everything you thought was important is less important than being completely committed to this one issue.
But is that what you think is happening? And I'll let you answer. My reading of it would be, it's worked. It's not saying that art isn't as important as the environment, which, again, you could have that debate. But if you'd have just filled in a form and sent a letter to an MP, you wouldn't be sat here talking about it. So it clearly works. You get the media discussion.
For sure.
Yeah.
But I think that's part of the. I think part of the tactic here is simply that if you're not going to win an argument with the public, or if you're not going to win the argument by kind of building a big democratic movement to get the things the policies that you want implemented. And by the way, of course, the reality is that a lot of politicians, great big section of the political establishment, is totally in favour of a lot of the things that Just Stop Oil and other activists are calling for anyway. The reality is that what this does is essentially take over the public realm, right? So that's the thing that's the tactic. It's saying, we're going to just take over everybody's attention, and we're going to even things that you think are sacred, right, or things that you cherish very much, they're not as important as the fact that we can take that space and get our message out there. Okay. I think there's some issues there about the takeover of public debate and the takeover of public space.
Are you trying to win hearts and minds of people?
Not of the people in the art gallery, but what we can see is that it's had the intended effect. So
And what is the intended effect?
The intended effect is to get policy change. And actually, what we've seen now with Labour is that they have ended new oil and gas licences, which is exactly what that campaign's main ask was.
So on that, 2 points would be, do you think the reason that Labour have ended that, do you think it's throwing... I know I'm making it seem too childish, but do you think it's the protests that have brought about that change, or the general election, which moved from a Tory government to a Labour government, brought about that change?
You're not going to be able to tease it apart. But what wasn't being talked about 3 years ago was oil and gas licences. I'd never heard of oil and gas licences. I'd be surprised if most of the people here had heard about oil and gas licences. But Just Stop Oil droned on and on and on. Every single time that a cultural action was taken or a slow march took place, all that we focused on was one clear demand to end oil and gas licences. We've got that conversation started. We've won that demand, yes. Okay. And so now our next demand is actually of the Labour government to sign up to an internationally binding treaty, a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, because there's no point in us going this alone. What we need is for countries around the world to go with us.
So do you give, should there be a period for the government to have a think about this before more soup gets thrown, or is there ever an end to the demand? When that one gets fulfilled, is this forever just going to be a case of, like, these acts will take place?
Well, look, I would love to not need to be going around throwing soup on things.
You're the one who's making the need.
Yeah.
It's not a need.
No.
Your aim is perfect.
No. If the politicians did their job, which was to protect public health, then we wouldn't need to step up and act.
But
we were talking earlier about...
your act is linked to the outcome.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can't say how much of a percentage of an influence it had, but what I know is that for decades, action has not been taken effectively enough on the climate crisis, and then shortly after quite large-scale disruptive action started taking place, we saw the conversation focus in on a clear issue that was the continued licensing of oil and gas, and now that the public is on board with that having ended.
Right. Do you think that art at some point could end up being safe, or from what you're hearing now, do you think, well, this is just going to be ongoing forever?
Well, I think that there is a bit of an issue with a certain group of activists who think that it's their right and their duty to basically constantly pull off these stunts, take over public debate, take over the media cycle, for things that actually are not necessarily policies that are not actually that popular. Right? It's not necessarily true that the public's with us, with Just Stop Oil. The fact is that the political establishment or political class, broadly speaking, is in sync with these kinds of policy demands. I would question whether, when it comes down to the idea of, like, cause and effect, I would really question it, look at it the other way around. I think activists like Just Stop Oil are actually are essentially repeating or parroting or projecting what is already a kind of consensus around policy, around climate policy.
But it must have been the case that those policies weren't enacted, otherwise we would...
Well, I think there is a bit of an issue, because I think actually a lot of people, the public is not necessarily totally on board with this. And there's a big split between ordinary people who have to deal with, the consequences of certain policy changes and initiatives, and politicians who are far more, broadly speaking, signed up for a lot of things which are actually going to kind of hit people down the line in terms of what the outcomes of those policies are for, everyday life, whether you get to drive a car, whether you get to fly, go and take an airplane on holiday, whatever. So there are things that there is, I think, a serious split between how people view the activists. And I think a lot of the frustration with Just Stop Oil was coming from the public. I think it was quite genuine that if Just Stop Oil was just getting in the way of you getting on with your day, right, it wasn't clear to a lot of people that that was a legitimate way to kind of make your message.
Quickly running out of time, I've got less than a minute. You must have seen the newspaper articles that have done some surveys saying that actually some of these acts are putting people off. Do you worry about that? Surely there's an argument for a change of angle?
So people don't need to like Just Stop Oil to hear our message, and our message has gotten through loud and clear. And actually, people do not like the actions that we take, and I take that on board. Like, nobody likes being disrupted.
Would it not be better to do an action that people liked, and then they might like your argument because of that?
Well, if that got through the same level of media coverage, then by all means, I'm ready to sign up for it. But this sort of action is what gets us the media coverage that is necessary to get this discussed.
We're running out of time, but OK, a fascinating discussion. Thank you, JJ Charlesworth, and spokesperson for Just Stop Oil, Dr. Kush. It's the end of the first hour of Free Speech Nation.